Okay, hello, humans. This is the third and final of three women doctors of late imperial China, and this doctor is named Zēng Yì. So let's look at her information. We can see her dates. So she did live past the Qing dynasty, but most of her life was in the Qing dynasty and which ended in 1911, and this book was published in 1907, very near at the very tail end of the Qing dynasty. She wrote a book called Collection from the House of Ancient Happiness, which was probably the name of the place that she lived. So Gǔhuān Shì Jí. And yeah, so let's see. This collection is actually like got 6 volumes. The first 2 are her poetry. She was like Gǔhuān. She was another doctor who wrote poetry, especially maybe when she was younger. We'll see she gave it up at some point. Then there are 2 volumes on medicine. One volume, actually, she counts it as 2 volumes on women's education. One volume is about, having kids and taking care of your family and taking care of your husband and keeping the house and so forth. And then the second volume is, you could call it a cookbook, but it's mainly on food preservation. And she thought that the younger generation wasn't being properly educated in how to take care of a household. And also, she wrote in the volume on food preservation about how frugality is a good attribute to have. And so food preservation is one way where, when there's a lot of something, then you can preserve it for later. I've translated that whole thing, although I haven't done anything with the translation. A really strong portion of it is about preserving meats, which I think we're less likely to do. Some of it's about, soybean stuff and vegetables and so forth. It's more interesting to me. Anyway, so we will see some of her writings from women's education and from the volumes on medicine in this little video. Um, so talking about her as a child, she wrote in the volume on women's education, she wrote about bound feet because that was still a thing that was becoming less common, but it was, mothers were still binding their daughters' feet in some places and, at this time. And she says, I remember as a child, every day when we came back from school, so note that she got to go to school, but my older brothers and their friends had no limits. They caught butterflies and looked for flowers with unrestrained pleasure. I was aware of the heavy weight my body carried, with feet like shackles. Even gently touching them made me cry. The suffering from this situation is unimaginable. So obviously, she was anti-foot binding, even though her feet had been bound. And so if she had daughters, I'm pretty sure she wouldn't have bound their feet. This was at a time when it really was decreasing, but not gone. So, okay, that's kind of, it makes me feel something in my heart. Anyway, then in the preface to the medical volume, she talks some about her interest in medicine and how it developed. Because my father died when I was a youth, my esteemed mother took us to live in his hometown. Okay, so her father, also like Gǔhuān, died in the Taiping Rebellion, which was in the middle of the 19th century. And these, people with a strange religion made a civil war, and the Qing government tried to stamp them out, and like millions of people were killed in the conflict. And so her father also, when she was 10, died in the Taiping Rebellion. And she had a bunch of sisters and brothers. So her mother had to figure out what to do. And generally, once you get married, you belong to the husband's family. Apparently, I forget, her father, I think, had some government position, and so he was stationed in different places at different times. And so she took her family to his hometown, which was, I believe, in Sichuan. And, then raised them there because that family would, take them in and give them a place to live. And she could be, with the children could be with their father's family, which is how things were looked at that time. So anyway, the family had a collection of medical books that was very complete. So in my spare time, for whatever reason, she liked reading the medical books and secretly became fond of medicine. This is an actual picture of her, I'm sure, when she was much older. Yeah. So some other stories. So her medical books were more like textbooks and not case study collections. I really like case studies, as you may know by now, but so her books, they have medicine. How do you treat this? How do you treat that? How do you treat the next thing? There's a big emphasis on Wenbing, or, warm disease, epidemic diseases, because it was really going strong during this period of the Qing dynasty. And anyway, so her medical books are not case studies, but here and there she told a little story. And here's a story that's from the second volume of the medical, the two medical volumes. The oldest sister in my family, her name was Zēng Yì, and she was constitutionally thin and weak. Her third labor was difficult. She swooned when the baby was born, losing consciousness and so forth. They poured in this formula called Shenghua Tang, but it was ineffective. So pouring in is when somebody's unconscious and then you dribble it into their mouth, and, hopefully you don't choke them by pouring too much in, and little by little they swallow it. At that time, I was attending to her medicine. Like, she wasn't her doctor. She was just cooking the medicine and bringing it to her and making sure she got it at the right time and that kind of stuff. But since she was already interested in medicine, she checked the medical books, and she was actually confident that this was qi desertion, not blood desertion. And so this Shenghua Tang is for blood desertion. We'll look at it in a minute. But she felt that it wasn't the right formula. So I then secretly poured half a cup of condensed ginseng decoction into the second boiling of it and had her take it, and she revived. So if you're a practitioner of Chinese herbal medicine, the formulas are often cooked more than once. So the first time she did it as directed by whoever the doctor was, but then she did her research and she decided that the doctor didn't really get it right, and she didn't feel empowered to change the whole formula, but she added a bunch of ginseng because of the qi desertion, and that's one of the things that ginseng can treat. So she, adjusted the formula, gave it to the patient, and she revived. There's something interesting here a little bit, not about the medicine, but about what's going on in their family. Zeng Yì was the second sister, and this one, Zhong Yì, was the one below that, younger. And yet, the older sister is taking care of the younger sister. The younger sister's already had, what is this? How many babies? Third. This is the third baby, and yet Zeng Yì will say on the next slide that she's not married yet. So how is it that the younger sister is not only married, but has had 3 babies before the older sister is married? I don't know if there was something about Zheng Yi that was hard to marry her, or if she was rebelling against being married, or what, but there's something going on in the family. Anyway, there were six sisters and four brothers, and then the father died. So you can see, wow, the mother's in trouble. That's why she went to the father's family. Okay, so Shenghua Tang is this formula by Fu Shan or Fu Qingzhu, who's like really famous gynecology doctor earlier in the Qing dynasty. And so it has Dangui, Chuanxiang, and Taoren. So there's a little bit of supplementation, but there's a lot of moving blood stasis. Um, like blast fried ginger and gansao. And so it's said to move blood, transform blood stasis. It warms the uterus and relieves pain, but it doesn't do anything for qi, does it? There are no qi herbs here. So this was commonly used for postpartum conditions involving cold and blood stasis, but not deficiency. And so she added the ginseng to adjust it, which I think is a standard modification, but not what the doctor had prescribed. So, continuing the story, at that time I was 20 years old and hadn't married yet, even though it's her younger sister's third baby. I never told anyone what I had done adding that ginseng. How could I have known that my sister would soon give birth to two more babies? That makes five. Then when the sixth baby arrived, her blood and qi were even more depleted than they were for this third baby, this incident. So when the baby was born, qi followed the blood loss, qi deserted, and she died. I, the pain. I mean, can you imagine? At the time, I had married and gone to Fujian with my husband, so I never saw her again. Until today, I think of her and deeply regret this. Remember, she said that she never told anyone, and so they still had the same incompetent doctor. And she was afraid to tell anyone because she was young and she was overstepping, you know, she was like counter counter I can't say that. She was going against what the doctor had prescribed, and so she never told anyone. But if she had told someone, maybe her sister would still have lived. That's what she's feeling. So she feels guilty about her sister dying. So now she says, I'm going to write an essay to tell you of my shame. So hopefully, hoping to benefit future generations. So this won't happen to, anyone else. Okay. So that's a kind of sad story. Here's when she was much older. You know, I forget the year she was born, but now it's already 1903, just 4 years before she wrote this book. Again, she's going to go against the doctors and do what she wants to do. So in 1903, I suffered spring warmth, which is a Wenbing term, an epidemic febrile disease that everybody was catching. It lasted a long time and it entered the lower jiao, which in Sanjiao theory of Wenbing, that when it enters the lower jiao, that's the deepest level. It's not using lower jiao the same way that we would in just everyday medicine, but in terms of Wenbing, that's a very specific term, and that means the like worst, the most like dangerous level. I was thirsty and my lips were scorched. It's a febrile disease. My tongue coat was black and my heart was vexed. I had fever that began in the late afternoon. My fluids were all dried up. The situation was extremely dangerous. When I requested doctors, they all wanted to give me Xiao Chai Hu Tang, but that didn't match. She didn't think it matched her condition. That's like Xiaoyang formula. This seems like later beyond the Xiaoyang stage. So she delayed taking it. She didn't take it. After this delay in treatment, so she really hadn't been treated, the disease reached my lower jiao, the end stage. Okay. So I decided to take this Sanjia Fumai Tang. 3 shells, return the pulse decoction. So she decided to take that on her own. And after intense shivering that shook the bedposts and my floorboards, after she took it, she had intense shivering that shook the bedpost and the floorboards. Then after this shivering and shaking, she sweat profusely. And then she started getting better. The evils were being resolved. So I took my own prescriptions of herbs after that, like Gǔhuān and Biejia, the turtle and tortoise shells, Muli, oyster shell, and all of these things that are used in, like the deep levels of Wenbing, Wenyin, and fluids are devastated. Anyway, so she modified it as she started improving, making, and so this Sanja, the 3 shells are like Gǔhuān, Biejia, Muli. So she, continued using those and she eventually recovered. So here is this 3-shell decoction to restore the pulse. It's from Wuzhitang or Wutang. He has, both names from Wenbing Qiaobian. And so, we can see we're, cooling the blood with Shengdi. Mai Mendong nourishing yin, moistening the intestines to help get some of maybe the logs out from below the fire, as they say, jiao, not a vegetarian formula by any means. Nourishes yin, restores the pulse, clears heat, anchors yang, extinguishes wind. Okay, so that's the formula that she took for herself. And she said after she recovered, then she, read more in Wenbing Qiaobian. I'm sure she had read it before, but now she decided to, double check information about this formula. And it says, when fluids are dried up, take herbs to preserve yin, which lots of those herbs do, especially the turtle shell and the tortoise shell. As fluids increase and the patient is about to sweat, the power of evils and right qi contend with each other, and this makes shivering and sweating. If they shiver and sweat, they will live. If they don't sweat, they will die. We saw that she took the herbs and then she started shivering so much it shook the bed and sweating. So that's exactly what Wenbing Qiaobian says. So she goes on. Fortunately, even though the disease lasted more than 10 days, which is a long time to have a very high fever, I didn't mistakenly take a supplementing prescription. So I recovered after shivering and sweating. Many people have found this formula to be effective, so it should truly be passed on. Okay, so, she treated herself, she treated her sister. And that's one of the things, like, it's not a case study book, but when she talks about treatments, they're like people like her husband or, people in her family. And we're going to see why, in a minute. Okay. So the volume of women's education, there's a preface by somebody who was important back then. I don't really know who he is, but he was important. And he said that Mrs. Zeng, Lady Zeng, was concerned about the critical situation. In China, there was a lot going on. All, Japan and the US and the various European countries were all pushing China to, make concessions to them. And there were also, just 50 years after the Taiping Rebellion, and there were also the monarchy was in decay and about to collapse, and so China was really in a lot of turmoil at this time. So she was concerned about the critical situation, and she urgently feared that women's education would not be supported. So she stopped playing around with poetry and calligraphy and painting. A lot of women in her family were poets and painters, and some of them were like well known at the time. Her mother was a poet and a calligrapher and a painter, and so she came from this family of women who were very creative. Anyway, she abandoned poetry, calligraphy, and painting, thinking they were of no use to the world. Therefore, on just your everyday, when nothing special is happening, she put this into practice and made herself a model of women's education. Then she wrote these 2 volumes on women's education or women's studies or whatever you want to call this. And so you might think that she was a feminist, and in some ways she was. She did want to raise the position of women, but she still thought women should stay home and not be out in the world. And that's part of why when you see that she treated, her cases are mostly about family members, it's because she wasn't doing it as a career, and we'll see her motivation here in this section. She said, when women are married, they become the actual female master of the household. That sounds like a fancy term, but it actually means the housewife. But she's in charge of the inside of the household. So she's connected to the security of the family. Therefore, if you want a strong country, you must begin to strengthen your own race. She's not using the word race like we do in the US today, but I'll talk about that in a minute. If you want the whole country's race to be strong, you must begin with your own household's health promoting practices. That being so, the impact of health promoting practices on the nation is very important. Therefore, we should not only value health promoting practices, but we should also study medicine. When we make the family strong, the country is strong. When the country is strong, our race is also strong because of this. So, first about race. China has a number of ethnic groups, and that's kind of this term race. Even though, like, if you're not Chinese, and you see somebody who's from a different ethnic group in China, a lot of the time they look the same to you. Whereas in the West, we think people of different races mostly look different. So it's kind of like ethnic group. But also, in addition to that, like I said, Japan, which they looked at as a totally different ethnic group, of course, and the West, including the US and England and other countries, were really bullying China, and they're obviously the different race, and even in our modern term of race. So basically, what she's saying that if you want China to be strong, you have to make the Chinese people, especially the Han Chinese people, be strong. Oh, and this was Qing Dynasty, and the Qing are, Manchurian, and they're like a different ethnic group for sure. So this word race includes ethnic groups that we still might consider, of the same, quote, race in modern terms. Really, the word race is unsupportable. Anyway, so she thought if we want China to be strong, we have to keep the Han Chinese people strong, and women have an important role in this because as mothers and as wives and as grandmothers, then we're in charge of the household, so we can make sure that they eat good and that they, are clean and that the house is clean and that the water's pure and that, all this kind of stuff. And so her volume on women's education is really a lot about, what you could call hygiene, not in the sense of just hand washing, although it includes, cleanliness, but just like lifestyle regimens that promote health, but not exactly nourishing life. It's hard to explain. It's a view that like we don't really have today. So she's not the feminist you might think in that women should still stay home and raise children, but they should have enough knowledge to keep the children healthy and strong so that they can grow up to make China healthy and strong. That's her point of view. And okay, so the last thing I want to point out, okay, a couple of things. One is I translated the whole book of Tan Yun-shen, and I talked about her in more detail. I translated the whole book of Gǔhuān, and I could talk about her in a lot more detail. I have not yet translated, Zēng Yi's writings besides, here and there. And I don't know if I will, but therefore, like what I have to say here, maybe I have less knowledge of her. Um, and since she didn't write cases, I'm a little less interested in her. And because she's kind of, yeah, women should stay home, I'm a little less interested in her. And I do want to say, so her book was published in 1907, and that's the same year that Qīng was executed for being a revolutionary. So women, there were feminists and revolutionary women who really wanted to shake things up at the same time. So, different people can have different views, and some people go farther than others. Qīng cross-dressed sometimes, and she carried around a dagger, and she was a revolutionary, and she got executed for her activity. So, I mean, yeah, it's that's a whole nother thing, but that's going on at the same time. And so just in comparison, yeah, Zheng Yì, I mean, I respect her. She was good, but like, she doesn't speak to me quite as much. I don't know about you. Anyway, that's that. I'll still have more case studies from especially Gǔhuān that, I'll put up. So there'll be more about, women doctors, but this is like my series on who these three women were. And then at the beginning, I had a overview of like women doctors in China historically. So I hope you have enjoyed all of this.